study of Muslim societies and civilizations, and we're very happy to have Scott Girdner today. On March 21st, Matthew Pierce, and you know that, will be speaking to us on his experience in Qom, Iran. And on April 11th, Jeremy Burt, who's a former graduate student, an undergraduate student of ours, who was working on his doctorate at the University of Illinois in
Northwestern.
That's good for you. I thought he was at the university. At Northwestern, in Sub-Saharan African Studies. And we're happy to be able to do this. And these will be archived. We're filming the talk, and we can use this, and you can treat this as a job interview. Send it out with your documentation. Well, this is going to be on, in part, certainly on Ghazali's The famous Niche of Lights, and I think we're in really very able hands today, so I'm not going to say any more, but just bring you up and throw you to the wolves.
Thanks for taking the pressure off with the job.
I thought I would. Always trying to oblige.
I'll keep it formal with my coffee cup up here. I mean, informal. Coffee cup up there, though. Okay, well, I am Scott Girdner. I'm a PhD student here in Islamic Studies. And before I proceed with the talk, I just wanted to thank Herbert Mason, the director of the Institute, and Michael Carroll for all their efforts in coordinating this event. There's a handout up here on the table. Maybe you can grab a few people. I think he should say. So before I proceed, I want to thank Herbert Mason and Michael Carroll and all of you for attending, of course. I'm excited about the series and the opportunity to share my research with the experts here at BU, and also look forward to the possibility of hearing the research of my colleagues in the future. So I'm glad to see the Institute getting underway, and the series in particular getting underway. I'll be presenting today on al-Ghazali's Mishkat al-Anwar, the Niche of the Lights, as you can see, but I'll be focusing on Ibn Sina's psychology and cosmology in this work, and particularly the significance of it. What does it mean that al-Ghazali is incorporating philosophy? But to do this, I'm going to need to provide an overview of the text that will be brief, hopefully. I can get through it briefly. So many of you are no doubt familiar with Ibn Sina and al-Ghazali, and I won't provide a lengthy contextualization of these figures, but I'll give you a brief background sketch. Ibn Sina is a famous doctor and philosopher. He's Persian, but he's known in the West as Avicenna. This indicates his importance both to Eastern and Western traditions. His medical works were used as part of curriculums in both the East and the West until the 16th and 17th century. So he's very significant as a medical figure in the history of science, but he's no less significant as a philosopher. And he often presented his philosophy in terms of allegories. So we have works such as Hayy ibn Yaqzan, Risalat al-Tayr, and Salaman wa Absal, where he presents his philosophy in allegorical terms. But beyond this, he also provides philosophical commentaries on several verses of the Quran, in particular the light verse he provides a commentary on. This, and we find it in his Kitab al-Isharat al-Tanbihat and Fi Ithbat al-Nubuwat, the proof of the prophecies and remarks and admonitions. So in both of these, he provides a philosophical commentary on the light verse, which is the basis of the Mishkat al-Anwar, the Niche of the Lights that I'll be discussing today. And we'll be exploring the relationship between this text and al-Ghazali's text, or these presentations and al-Ghazali's presentations. Al-Ghazali is a Persian also. He's also known in the West by a Latin name, al-Ghazal. And primarily in the West, he's known as a philosopher. His works were translated into Latin, or a few of them were. The Qasida philosopher, the attention to the philosophers in particular, was translated into Latin. But his most famous work is the Ihya Ulumuddin, the revival or revivification, you'll see it translated in various ways, of the religious sciences. This is a compendium of ethics, law, Sufism, theology, a little dash of philosophy. It's a book that explores the religious sciences from a variety of perspectives, or books, I should say. The Deliverance from Error is his famous spiritual autobiography, which is well known and of some significance to my presentation. And his critique of philosophy, the incoherence of the philosophers, to Hafid al-Falasifa, is also of some significance for this presentation. And then he levels a famous critique of philosophy. So the work we're looking at today, though, is the Mishkat al-Anwar, the Niche of the Lights. And it's a commentary on Quran 24:35, the famous light verse that we'll look at in a moment. And the hadith are saying of the Prophet Muhammad that concerning veils of light and darkness, and we'll look at this in a moment too. It's important to note, though, that this is a late work. It represents his mature thought on philosophy and Sufism. It's usually considered to be contemporaneous, give or take a year or two with the biography, The Deliverance from Error. So you'll find the text of the light verse in your handout. It's excerpt 1, but it's also on the screen. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. Its light is like a niche, inside which is a lamp. The lamp is inside a glass. The glass is like a shining star, lit from a blessed olive tree, neither eastern nor western, whose oil would almost shine even if untouched by fire. Light upon light, God guides whom he wills to his light. God draws comparisons for people, and God knows all things. The Veils Hadith, you'll find in excerpt 2 of your handout, and it's also on the screen. God has 70 veils of light and darkness. Were he to lift them, the august glories of his face would burn up everyone whose eyesight perceived him. So these two passages provide the basis for the text of the Mishkat al-Anwar, the Niche of the Lights. Now, al-Ghazali will develop his commentary that incorporates elements of philosophy on the basis of these two texts. So the Niche proceeds according to 3 sections or divisions. In the first one, al-Ghazali presents a hierarchy of lights, and then he argues that God is the real light and that all else is metaphor. All other things that we consider to be light are only light in the sense that they're metaphorically called light. The second section, he presents his actual interpretation of the language of the light verse, and in this we'll see he follows the precedent of Ibn Sina, that he interprets it in terms of the faculties of the soul, or philosophical psychology. And in the third section, he presents his interpretation of the Veils Hadith that we just looked at, and he includes in this an interesting philosophy of religion that we'll also see. So just a quick overview of these sections. In the first section is the most important. He establishes the basis of his argument for the text in this section. And he states his purpose is clarifying that the real light is God and that the name light for everything else is sheer metaphor without reality. So he sort of inverts maybe what our expectation is. The text, when it says God is the light of the heavens and the earth, it's not making a metaphorical statement. And this conforms to al-Ghazali's exegetical principle that the literal meaning must be held in any interpretation as long as it's not impossible. And you can have a deeper interpretation that you develop, but it must be parallel to the literal meaning. He lays this out in the second chapter of the Mishkat, but elsewhere in other words, such as Jawahir al-Quran and other words. So he says that God is not like light, but rather light is like God. This is his approach to the text. And to do this, he creates a hierarchy of lights and makes an argument that if we imagine a room that's dark, and we have a rock in that room, so a piece of dark matter, then we cannot see the rock, because it's dark, and the rock is certainly not illuminating the room. So if we replace that rock with a coal, we can imagine that we can see it glowing in this dark room, but it's not really illuminating the room. It's just, or very faintly. Relatively, it's casting no light. But it's apparent in itself. So it's more worthy of the name light than the rock because it's apparent, but it's not casting light. Now, Ghazali will argue that the secret or the definition of light is that it makes things manifest. So the coal is manifest itself to the observer. We can see it, it's apparent, but it's not making the rest of the room manifest. However, maybe a candle's flame, it illuminates the room partially. It flickers and it's a little bit dim, but it illuminates the room and it's apparent in itself. So Ghazali will say this is more worthy of the name light because it's apparent and it manifests other objects, and that's the secret of light, that it manifests things. So we'll continue beyond this and say that the sun is more fully illuminating. So it's more worthy of the name light because it illuminates all things. So it's created this hierarchy where we're moving up to those things that are most worthy of the name light. But in order for the sun to illuminate all things and be apparent in itself, which it is, it needs an observer to observe it. If we were blind, the sun could illuminate things, it could be apparent in itself, and yet it would be meaningless to us. It would not be manifest to us as observers. So observation, manifestation to the observer, requires a seeing eye. Because of this, al-Ghazali will argue that the light of the eye, the faculty of vision, is more worthy of the name light. And he establishes some arguments based on an Arabic idiom that the eyesight of a bat, the light of a bat's eyesight is weak, or that a blind man, the light of his eyesight has gone out. But his main argument is that eyesight makes things manifest to the observer. And so it's more worthy of the name light because this is the secret of light. But then he'll designate that the eye has 7 imperfections. For instance, one of them is that things that are far away appear to be smaller than they actually are. So vision is susceptible to sensory illusions. And then he goes on to argue that though we do have a faculty that makes things manifest, an inner eye that is free, is defined by being free of these illusions, these sensory illusions, and this is the intellect. The intellect makes things manifest to the observer, and so it's more worthy of the name light. And then in the final step, or almost final step, the penultimate step, he'll say that there are intellects above the human intellect that are more perfect. They know things in a more perfect modality. So these are more worthy of the name light. And these are the angelic intellects. And he associates them with the celestial realm and with angels who move the heavenly bodies and their spheres. So these are more worthy of the name light. And we can see in this scheme that he's established a hierarchy that's psychological. He discusses the faculties of the soul. There's the sensible faculty and the intellectual faculty. But it's also cosmological. He moves from the intellect to the cosmos, and he discusses these celestial, angelic intellects. But we also see that, well, we will see that he includes in this an ontology. The highest ascent is God. And to understand this fully, we need to move forward a little bit in the book. Eventually, al-Ghazali will say that the ultimate in non-manifestation is non-being. Something that does not exist is absolutely non-manifest. So this is the utmost darkness, and it should really be below the rock in the dark room. That's the absolute most dark. So the most manifesting thing is the thing that gives being. This is God, and he is the highest light because he manifests all things, being itself. So we see that the hierarchy of lights that he has created here includes a cosmology, a psychology, even an epistemology because the intellect knows things better than the senses do, and also an ontology, a theory of being. So the third section, he presents the veils, hadith. And he talks about veils of darkness, and he creates another hierarchy, a range of lights again, but this time they correspond to veils. And the darkest veils, being veiled by pure darkness, corresponds to atheists and materialists. They have a poor conception of God and poor awareness of God. Then those who are veiled by mixed veils, veils of light and darkness, are idolaters, dualists, polytheists, those who have some conception that there's a deity or deities, but they don't conceive of this deity correctly. And it even includes monotheists who think of God in an overly anthropomorphic sense, or especially a bodily sense. So those who are veiled by pure light are those who have a pure conception of monotheism, and this has further gradations in it, and the highest reaches of this are first the mystics, and then above them, the prophets. So he creates this hierarchy, and we can see how the third section and the first section are integrated by this sort of idea of a hierarchy of lights. The second section is where he actually presents his commentary on the language of the light verse, which we saw in excerpt 1 of the handout. In it, al-Ghazali will argue that the niche corresponds to the sense faculties, because, for instance, a niche is a hollowed out place in the wall where you set the lamp. And the senses go out from our bodies from hollowed out places like our mouth, our eyes, our ears, or our nostrils. It doesn't really deal with fingers, but for the most part, he says senses come out from these hollowed out places. The imaginative faculty is the glass. I won't really go into why that is. The lamp is the rational faculty for the same reason that we've seen in the hierarchy of light. The lamp makes things manifest, and we saw that he argues the rational faculty makes things manifest to the observer. He says that the tree is the reflective faculty because it operates by branching dialectics. It takes two concepts and puts them together to come to a new concept. The oil that would almost shine even if untouched by fire is the prophetic faculty, which in al-Ghazali's usage also includes the mystical capacity of humanity. That terminology can be confusing. And the fire is the angelic intellect or revelation. Ibn Sina uses this he does not use the exact same approach to the language. He uses much more technical philosophical language. He speaks in terms of the intellects as derived from Neoplatonic, Aristotelian philosophy of the soul. But nonetheless, much of his language would incorporate the faculties that al-Ghazali designates. And in particular, the tree, the oil, and the fire are all synonymous or virtually synonymous. So we see both al-Ghazali and Ibn Sina are interested in interpreting the language of the light verse in terms of the faculties of the human soul. And that Ibn Sina seems to be al-Ghazali's precedent for this. I haven't found it in any other exegetical literature. And it makes sense that Ibn Sina would be a source for this because we know al-Ghazali is familiar with Ibn Sina's work. One of the ways we know that is one of the reasons it's surprising to find him incorporating Ibn Sina's commentary so prominently in his own, because al-Ghazali's critique of philosophy is pointed in his criticism of Ibn Sina in particular. It's Tahafut al-Falasifa is a critique of philosophy, and so we might think, or it may be presented simplistically as a rejection of philosophy, but we should remember that it's a more sophisticated work. Al-Ghazali argues in this work that the philosophers fail their own criteria for logical demonstration, and particularly in the field of metaphysics. And of all the premises that he identifies as that the philosophers have failed to demonstrate, he only sanctions 3. He only says 3 are outside the vague. But the thrust of his argument is because the philosophers do not logically demonstrate the doctrines in terms of metaphysics, there's no reason to believe the doctrine over traditional belief, over revelation. They have no logical case for their belief. So his critique is philosophical and it's sophisticated and it's limited in scope, and he's careful to preserve what he considers to be useful. Geometry in particular he isolates, but other elements of philosophy he preserves. And so this might help us to understand why he would be incorporating elements of his interpretation into his own. His position on philosophy is not simplistic. However, there's a long history of controversy concerning the significance of the philosophical content in the Rishkat. Ibn Rushd, Averroes as he's known in the Latin tradition, says that al-Ghazali eventually contradicts his critique of philosophy in the Tahafut, or the incoherence of the philosophers. He says that ultimately al-Ghazali embraces philosophical doctrines that he rejected. Ibn Tufayl, for instance, disagrees with him. So we have from a very early date people disagreeing about the significance of the philosophical content in the Mishkat. And this is continued into contemporary scholarship. Herbert Davidson and Richard Frank, in particular, both think that Ibn Rushd's reading is correct, that Ghazali embraces philosophical doctrines that contradict his position in the Tahafut, contradict the position he repeated in the Munkith, his personal biography. So these scholars argue that al-Ghazali embraces philosophical doctrines that contradict his own positions elsewhere stated and even traditional understandings of God. Michael Marmora and Ahmed Dalal have both argued that there's serious problems with Frank's analysis that have to do with his tendency to read the passages in isolation. And although his analysis is detailed and erudite in its ability to identify philosophical influence, that his decontextualization of the passage misunderstands al-Ghazali's use of these passages in his work. Their methodology has influenced my own reading of Mishkat, and I've argued in a paper I'm happy to provide anyone who wants it that Herbert Davidson's reading of the Mishkat, where he argues that al-Ghazali upholds the eternity of the world, does the same thing, that it misreads the philosophical content of Mishkat. So for the remainder of the talk, I'll be arguing that we need to understand the context in which al-Ghazali presents the philosophical doctrines in Mishkat to understand their significance, to understand to what purpose he's employing philosophy. Is it because he agrees ultimately with the philosophers? Is it because he rejects his position in the incoherence of the philosophers? Or is it for some other reason? I'll be arguing it's for some other reason. And it's for a reason that's consistent with the Tahafud and the Mumkin min al-Dalal, his autobiography. So the Mishkat al-Anwar in my reading is a type of ta'wil or allegorical interpretation. It attempts to incorporate philosophical doctrine and simultaneously limit it. And it subordinates philosophical doctrine to the authority of the Quran and mystical experience in particular. To do this, though, I'm going to need to move beyond the basic identification of Ibn Sina as a precedent for al-Ghazali's interpretation of the light verse, and we'll have to look at other philosophical content in the Mishkat. Which means, unfortunately, we have to wrestle with a lot of obscure philosophical concepts, such as Ibn Sina's necessary existence. And I have wrestled with how to present this concisely and clearly, and this is my best effort. Let's see if it works. So, Ibn Sina argues that if a subject possesses an attribute such as existence, they can possess it in one of two ways. They can possess it accidentally, in which case that attribute, existence, is possessed potentially at one time and actually at another time. So a subject is potentially existing at one time and then actually existing at another time. On the other hand, a subject can possess an attribute such as existence essentially, which means that subject possesses that attribute at all times. It's always actual, and it's never potential. Now, if a subject possesses existence as an attribute accidentally, it must have a cause that moves it from potential existence to actual existence. This is just part of Ibn Sina's doctrine, but Ibn Sina's doctrine also upholds that there cannot be an infinite regressive causes. So there must be a first cause that moved all other things from potential existence to actual existence. This is the necessary existent. It possesses existence essentially, that is always actually, and it's the cause that makes everything else actual. That's the argument. You can find it in excerpt number 3 on your handout. Perhaps this is more lucidly stated, I don't know. It certainly says it concisely in the handout. Indeed, anything that is anything in essence is with it in actuality, as long as it is existed. And anything in a thing accidentally, or non-essentially, is in it at one time potentially and at another time actually. And one who has that thing in essence, so it is in him in actuality forever. He is the one who brings what is potential to actuality. And just for those of you who read Arabic, I call your attention to the term he's using there for essence is that. And we'll see this again. So let's look at this concept in the Mishkat. You'll find these excerpts in excerpt 4a. Al-Ghazali says existence can be classified into the existence that a thing possesses in itself, and he says here, be that he says min that he, excuse me. So existence that a thing possesses from its essence, and that which it possesses from another. When a thing has existence from another, its existence is borrowed, and with respect to itself, it is pure non-existence. And then he goes on to say, hence the real existent is God, just as the real light is He. You'll see this in excerpt 4a. So it appears that al-Ghazali is incorporating some of Ibn Sina's distinction between contingent and essential existence. But it goes on from that passage immediately following that. It goes an important subsection entitled "The Reality of the Reality." It's the only one to receive such an important title in the entire work. And he says, "From here, those who know climb from the lowlands of metaphor to the highlands of reality, and they perfect their ascent. Then they see, witnessing with their own eyes, that there is none in existence save God, and that everything is perishing except His face." This is an allusion to Quran 28:88. So what does this mean? Al-Ghazali does seem to include Ibn Sina's distinction between contingent and necessary existence. However, his language doesn't press that division to a logical conclusion. He doesn't repeat Ibn Sina's argument and to all its logical points. Rather, instead, he turns to the authority of revelation and to this quotation from the Quran. So it appears that the doctrine of the necessary existence is known through the authority of revelation by those who know, the mystics, who witness it with their own eyes. The philosophical doctrine has thus been subordinated to the authority of the Quran. So let's look at another example, because that's not conclusive. The doctrine of the Act of Intellect. Again, a little bit obscure, but we saw part of this in Excerpt 3. The argument that an agent must act to move something from potentiality to actuality. This is the Act of Intellect. It's true of the human potential to know something, or our potential intellect. In order for it to become actual, for us to have actual knowledge, some agent must act to move our intellect from potentiality to actuality. For Ibn Sina, this is the Act of Intellect. And this intellect is associated with a series, well, these cosmic intellects are associated with a series of spheres that emanate from the One, and sort of Neoplatonic conception of the emanating universe. And these correspond to celestial bodies and to angels. So you can see in Excerpts 3, again, we've seen this one, but if you look at Excerpts 5a and b, you can see his use of this language, his concern for moving something from potentiality to actuality, an agent who must do that, and his concern to associate this with intellects and with angels. And so we see from a quote from Excerpt 3, we saw at the end of that, "He is the one who brings what is potential to actuality, that is the necessary existence." And we see in Excerpts 5a and b, "The acquired intellect is the perfection of the material intellect, and the one who brings it out from potentiality to actuality." So here we see that interest in an agent acting to move from potentiality to actuality associated with intellects. The one who brings the angelic intellect to perfect actuality and the material intellect to the level of the angelic intellect, it is the Act of Intellect. Here we see some inclusion of language concerning angels. So let's look at this doctrine in the Mishkah and pay particular attention to the idea of an agent that needs to act to move the intellect from potentiality to actuality. It appears in the Mishkah that the Quran is described in terms of the Act of Intellect. It transforms potential knowledge into actual or acquired knowledge. And you can see it in Excerpts 6a and 6b. In this, just for context for the first excerpt, al-Ghazali is setting up a distinction between two types of knowledge that is in itself fairly reminiscent of Ibn Sina's division of knowledge between practical and theoretical. But pay attention in this excerpt in particular to the idea that an agent must act to make this theoretical knowledge actual. Among those other issues concerning types of knowledge is that type of knowledge which does not unite with the intellect in every case when shown to it. Rather, it needs to have its inclinations shaken, and it needs its kindling device to kindle and inform it with theoretical information. Only the speech of wisdom informs it. Here it is. So that with the radiation of the light of wisdom, the intellect sees in actuality what it was seeing in potentiality. He goes on in Excerpt 6b to say the greatest of wisdom, this follows immediately in the text, the greatest of wisdom is the speech of God Most High, and among all of his speech, the Quran in particular. So that we see here that the Quran is associated with the Act of Intellect. It is the agent that moves the potential knowledge of a human to actual knowledge. This association is even more, was highlighted more when we consider what follows immediately after that. Al-Ghazali goes on to say, thus the sending down of the verses of the Quran for the intellectual eye is like the sending down of the light of the sun for the eye of sensory perception, since with it seeing is perfected. So it is appropriate that the Quran is called light, just as the light of the sun is called light. So the likeness of the Quran is the light of the sun, and the likeness of the intellect is the light of the eye. This metaphor is made by al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. They both say that the act of intellect corresponds to the potential intellect in the same way that the sun corresponds to the sensory eye. So again, we see this association of the Quran with the role of the act of intellect. So what does this mean? There's the slide there. Possibly al-Ghazali means to say that the two are synonymous, that the act of intellect is the Quran, but I'm personally skeptical about that. I think that his apparent equation is meant to show his acceptance of the philosopher's doctrine that an agent must act to make knowledge actual. He seems to accept their arguments in this work and in others, that an agent must make potential knowledge actual knowledge. But it's interesting in this work that rather than mention anything about an act of intellect, he turns to the Quran and suggests that it is the agent that actualizes potential knowledge. So I'll just emphasize that he never mentions the act of intellect in this passage. He describes the Quran in terms of the act of intellect. So the transforming act seems to be explicitly associated with revelation. So now we come to probably the most complex concept, but it's also the one that integrates all of these together. We've seen in the hierarchy of lights that it included cosmology, that we moved from the intellect into the celestial spheres, and the intellects of the angels in that sphere. We've seen that it included an epistemology, that we moved from sense perception and its 7 imperfections to the rational faculty and its perfections in the hierarchy. And we've seen also that al-Ghazali will describe this in terms of an ontology at the beginning. So this is common. This is a common image among the philosophers as well. That there's the epistemological ascent, the ascent through the various levels of intellect, corresponds to a cosmological ascent. That each of these angelic intellects that actualize our knowledge in a philosophical sense correspond to heavenly bodies of some sort. So there's a sort of association of progression through modes of knowing and progression through the cosmos. You can see several examples of al-Ghazali's association of the cosmic lights and the intellectual realm with the angelic beings and their interaction with humanity in excerpts 7a through D. I would just call attention to excerpt 7b, for instance. As for the intellectual and material lights, the higher world is filled with them. They are the substances of angels. So here we see he associates the intellectual realm with angels. 7c, the mover of each specific heaven is a different existent thing called an angel, of whom there are many. So here we see that he associates the intellectual realm with angels and the movement of the celestial spheres with both intellects and angels. But it's important to note that while al-Ghazali shares this sort of vision of epistemological ascent and cosmological ascent, and he's playing with this philosophical idea, that he gives it an important Quranic reference throughout the text. Specifically, he's referring to Abraham's encounter with a series of setters, referred to in Quran 75 through 79. And you'll find the text for this in excerpt 8. And it's when the darkness descends over Abraham, he sees a star rise on the horizon, and he says, "This is my Lord." But then the star sets, and he's disappointed the star is not his Lord. So then the moon rises, and he says, "This is my Lord," and it also sets, and he's concerned about his ability to find his Lord. So the sun rises, and he says, "This is my Lord," and the sun sets as well. So finally, Abraham turns his face to the one who originates the heavens and the earth, the one who originates all of these bodies that rise and set. So we see this is also associating sort of modes of knowing, perhaps. Exegetes interpret this passage differently. Some say that Abraham's offering a rhetorical argument. Some say that no, he's actually refining his knowledge of monotheism through this progression. So it depends on how you read it. But it seems like there's sort of a progression through cosmological bodies and at least the way he presents an understanding of God. And this allusion is of great significance in the Mishkat. Ghazali refers to it regularly, and it seems like this is how he's contextualizing his philosophical conception of progression through the cosmos and progression through modes of knowing. So the most significant passage for this presentation is in the third section, the Veils Hadith. When he's discussing it, he describes those who are veiled by pure light, the mystics. They arrive at a place where they turn their face, like Abraham, to the one who originates the heavens and the earth. So we see at the height of this ascent through the veils, one has an experience that's exemplified by Abraham. It comes to an understanding that's exemplified by Abraham, according to al-Ghazali's illusion. And I should note, in this passage there are actually multiple references. He refers to the star, the moon, and the sun. But for concision, I've just cited this one example. They turn their face to the originator of the heavens and the earth. And you'll see this in excerpt 9a. Then he goes on to describe those who reach this level. He says, they have arrived at an existent thing that is incomparable with everything that their sight had perceived. Hence the august glories of his face, the first, the highest, burn up everything perceived by the sights and insights of the observers. So those who are exemplified by Abraham in this illusion come to a place where they discover the meaning of the Veils Hadith. They discover what it is to have everything burned up by the august glories of God's face. So what is this state like? He goes on immediately to say, they become extinct from themselves, that's Fanat, so that they cease observing themselves. Nothing remains save the one, the real. These are names of God. The meaning of his words, everything is perishing but his face, becomes for them a taste, Dhauk, and a state, Hal. So we know, I've been noting the Sufi terminology here. But we notice then at the highest state, the highest ascent of the Veils Hadith, those people who are exemplified by Abraham, turning their face to the one who originates the heavens and the earth, come to a taste, a mystical knowledge of the scriptural reference that we saw earlier. Everything is perishing but his face. And this becomes for them a state. Thus, the Veils Hadith describes the annihilation of ego and all things in the contemplation of God. This provides experiential knowledge of the Quranic passage concerning God's face. And just as earlier we saw that the logical proof of the necessary existent was replaced with this passage, we now see that the passage, the proof does have a proof. It's in mystical experience. So there is a necessary existent, but it's known through mystical experience, not through the logical arguments of the philosophers. In the Munqidh min al-Dalal, al-Ghazali, this is his personal spiritual autobiography, al-Ghazali discusses a hierarchy of faculties there as well. And he says that there are sensible faculties, and these do not provide certain knowledge. There are intellectual faculties, these provide more certain knowledge. For instance, he gives the same example. They can tell us that something far away looks smaller than it really is. So our intellect can correct our sensible mistakes. But then he goes on to say there's a faculty above the rational faculty, and it alone can provide true certainty. And this is the mystical faculty. And it's confirmed in the experience, Dhauk, tasting that reality. So we see that the Quranic and mystical contextualization of philosophical content in the Mishkat suggests an epistemological model similar to the Munqidh. The Mishkat has mystical experience in the inner appropriation of scriptural truth as its highest reaches of knowledge, just as the Munqidh does. Philosophical material is certainly incorporated, but subordinated to revelation and mystical experience. Thus, the Mishkat does not represent a significant departure in al-Ghazali's position on philosophy. This study suggests that a more developed sense of the Mishkah's ostensible purpose, a commentary on the Quran according to a saying of the Prophet, has a significant impact on our understanding of the significance of this incorporation of philosophical content. And readings of the text that disregard this contextualization and just focus on the philosophical content in isolation miss the significance of al-Ghazali's presentation in that context, and that is that philosophical certainty is limited, and mystical certainty is above it. So, as a postscript to this, I just want to discuss aspects of where my research has been heading recently. I've done research on the background of exegetical traditions leading up to Ibn Sina and al-Ghazali on Surat al-Nur, this passage, the light verse, to see what possible sources al-Ghazali could be drawing on besides Ibn Sina. But I've also been looking at the reception of the text, particularly in Jewish and Christian tradition. I've located 2 manuscripts of a Hebrew translation of the Mishkah that roughly are dating to the 13th century right now. I have to get a more precise date on that. That I'm translating. Many of the works of al-Ghazali were actually translated into Hebrew in the 13th century. And some of them is very exciting because when they moved into Jewish tradition, they were recontextualized so that references to the Quran were changed to references to Hebrew scriptures. That doesn't happen in this text. So far, my research anyway, my preliminary research, I've translated the passage on the everything is perishing but God's face and the ascent of the mystics. And there seems to be no real awareness that these are Quranic allusions, or there's no interest in pointing them at the Hebrew scriptures. But nonetheless, I'm toiling with this, these manuscripts and making my way through them, and they're fairly literal in the translation. But what's particularly interesting to me now is that when Yohanan Alamano commented on the Mishkah and said that it admired its hermeneutical method and compared it to the Zohar, a book of Jewish mystical tradition, Kabbalah, a significant work of Kabbalah, and found much to compare. And Yohanan Alamano was the Kabbalah and Hebrew instructor of Pico della Mirandola, the famous Italian humanist and Renaissance thinker whose oration on the dignity of man is sometimes considered the manifesto of the Renaissance. And so I found some suggestive passages in this. I can demonstrate a chain of transmission from Alamano to Pico della Mirandola, but I cannot exclude alternative chains of transmission. So these are no guarantee that this is an influence of al-Ghazali. I need to research it further, but nonetheless, they're intriguing quotes. The first one is on your handouts. I don't know which excerpt it is. But Pico says, to speak of the angelic nature, which is pure intellect, let us first imagine that minds are like eyes. What the eye is among the corporeal things, the mind is in the spiritual realm. So we see here an interest in presenting the transition from the sensory to the intellectual, and from this world, the terrestrial world, to the celestial world, presented in terms of this analogy between the mind and the eye. And the context which he presents this in is very reminiscent of the Mishkah. He's creating this hierarchy of levels of being. So he goes on in another passage to say, the felicity of man is limited either to the mere search of truth, as academics do, or to its attainment through the study of philosophy, as al-Farabi said. Avicenna, Averroes, Abu Bakr, he's referring to Ibn Tufayl there. Alexander, I think of Aphrodisias. And the Platonists seem to allow somewhat more, basing our reason as on its proper end on the act of intellect, or on some greater one which is nevertheless related to us. But they lead man neither to his beginning nor to his end. So what he's saying there is, these thinkers say that there's this act of intellect that you can connect with, and for some of them this is equivalent to prophecy, or at least the highest connection with the act of intellect is close to prophecy. And we've just seen that al-Ghazali is reluctant to go that far. He says, yes, intellectual connection with this intellect is important, it actualizes knowledge perhaps, but what actualizes knowledge more is revelation, it's this mystical state, or tasting, And the type of knowledge it actualizes for Ghazali is certain knowledge. It's not necessarily theoretical or practical knowledge like the philosophers say. So he goes on in the final passage to say, the true and perfect felicity, the return to our beginning that is ultimate happiness, carries us back to the contemplation of the face of God. So we can perhaps hear in this an echo of everything is perishing but God's face, the passage that ends up being the climax of the Mishkat al-Mubarak. We see there that al-Ghazali, at that point in the book, has connected the idea that light is manifestation, the manifestation of being is ultimate light, that is God. The experience of this is tasting, it's a mystical unveiling. And this is what the Veils Hadith describes of the truth of Scripture when it says that everything is perishing but God, that God is the only real existent. And this is exemplified by Abraham, in his allusions to Abraham. So I have no idea in terms of time where I am, if I went too fast or slow, but I'm happy to take questions and appreciate your patience.
Scott, thank you. This is wonderful. I just wondered if you'd also thought about the connections between this passage and also a similar verse in Surah Ar-Rahman, which says, كل ما عليها فان ويبقى وجه ربك ذو الجلال والإكرام. You know, everything on it, on earth, perishes, and the face of God persists. The essence, the Lord, the embodiment, well, maybe not embodiment, because that's too anthropomorphic, the manifestation of nobility and majesty.
Yeah, I have, and it surprises me actually that Ghazali doesn't develop that reference more, and then everywhere you look, there's space to look.
Mm-hmm.
That he doesn't develop these illusions more. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure why he does not do that. It does seem, though, that the, or at least, for instance, Kristen Zahra Sands in her recent book on Sufi exegesis argues that the Mishkat provides conclusive evidence of al-Ghazali's influence on Ibn al-Arabi, that he interprets mystical states in terms of ontological states of being, or concepts of being, and she says this work is an example of that, and then I know in that tradition they do develop that illusion. So it's possible, and there's also this other work, the Ma'arij al-Quds. It's debated whether or not al-Ghazali is authentic or not. It's certainly more philosophical, but what's interesting is it's also more, in my reading, Asharite. It follows, it's more explicit to maintain traditional conceptions of attribute doctrine. So if that work is authentic, it may have an illusion. It has more, it develops a commentary on the light verse, and it has more complex and nuanced development of the sort of concept of God as the necessary existent, as confirmed by mystical experience. But I don't know off the top of my head if it does for sure or not. I'm still unfamiliar with that work. One of the things I'm hoping actually is I explore this further is that some of my research will shed some light on the debate as to whether or not that work is authentic. Certainly to the extent that some people have argued it's not authentic because it incorporates Ibn Sina's doctrine, that has to be questioned because we can see that al-Ghazali, many people have argued, have demonstrated that al-Ghazali incorporates Ibn Sina's doctrines. The question is, why does he incorporate them? So when we look at that work and this one together, I think a lot of interesting things will happen.
You mentioned that that you've come to the conclusion that the Hebrew translations of al-Ghazali, al-Mishkat, are 13th century. I'm interested in knowing on what basis you come to that conclusion, and also if there's any indication as to where the translations were made.
Yes. Okay. That is a very preliminary conclusion. In fact, I'm entirely following Mortiz or Mortimer M. Steinschneider, the famous bibliographer of Hebrew manuscripts in Europe and around the world. He dates it to the 13th century, and there's good reason to sort of follow this, but just very general reasons. A lot of the translations of his works were going on at this time. This is, in fact, when a migration to the north is occurring among the Jewish community, and they're losing their ability to speak Arabic, and there's concern that the learning will be lost. So lots of works are being moved into Hebrew at this al-Amal is translated at this point in time. So I think that Stein-Schneider is probably just giving a hunch there. But the manuscripts are attributed to Jacob Joseph al-Fassi. No one seems to know much about him. I've looked in several indices of Jewish thinkers in the Middle Ages and haven't come up with much information on him. It's in fact, largely we know more about those who commented on the text like Yohanan al-Mana, who are several centuries later than the 13th century, or at least a century later.
Is it possible that the translation was made in Spain?
Yeah, it's likely the translation was made in northern Spain or southern France, one of those regions. And if we made it to Alemano, he's heavily influenced by Abu Lafia, the Jewish mystic. And so we're talking again about sort of northern Spain, southern France, all the way into north Italy. Really good for that. But again, my findings on this manuscript are very preliminary. I've translated about 3 passages. It's a strange script. It looks kind of like a Rashi script, but there are subtleties that I cannot detect if they are the scribe's hand, or it's a unique sort of provincial or Andalusian script. I'm not entirely certain. I've managed to get myself to the point where I can read it, and I'm content with that at this stage. Yes. I'm sorry.
I wanted to ask, sort of more in the religious direction. I think there's also a hierarchy. There's a hierarchy of religious development. I think it corroborates what you're saying. If we start at the sort of the level of the externals of the faith and the external rituals, and we ascend up through that. And the passage that interests me very much is the comment about the external practice that you shall not keep a dog in your house. It says there are certain people that think they have risen above that they have sort of discerned the inner meaning, and they think they can discard the external practice. And he says, well, that's a terrible mistake. And as I understand, in some way, the mistake is that the external practice is like the glass that protects the flame inside that could get blown away by winds. So
there are some interesting Sufi commentaries that associate different stages in the language of the light verse with the law, knowledge of the law, knowledge of purity, so with mystical states. That sort of go along with that idea that there's the outward manifestation of the law, and it's necessary to cultivate the inner transformation that the law will bring to the mystic. And you're right that that's one of the most fascinating aspects of this text. I couldn't really present it because it's a separate presentation. But the final section, certainly, the Veil's Hadith, where he creates sort of his philosophy of religion, is interesting in this regard, where he describes idolaters and polytheists and those who have misconceptions of God in a fairly sympathetic light. We'll say things, for instance, that they recognize beauty, they know that beauty is an attribute of divinity, they just mislocate it. They think it's a beautiful idol. And then there's one who's above that, who thinks that, well, it's just beauty wherever we find it. So if this tree is beautiful, I'll worship the tree. And if that person is beautiful, I'll worship that person. At least this person, he says, has progressed to understanding that beauty is not located in one place. So they're getting closer to understanding God. So he traces this hierarchy up, and he shows that, like, the conceptions of the idolaters, the dualists, the anthropomorphic monotheists are flawed, but their intent is somewhat, it's not admirable, but is not fully condemnable. So it's a really interesting aspect of the text, how he develops the idea of sincerity in practice, and how there's a hierarchy of it, and how we can progress through it, and how wide an umbrella he casts for that idea that practice can be reforming.
I had a follow-up question that actually, there is, I just reread this today. Again, and every time I read it, there's something new comes up. And today was this notion of not progress, but actually descent from the higher levels. There was a quote from the Quran that he quoted, which is, "Our Lord, we have seen and heard, now return us." This is upon arriving, and after arrival, since we can only perish in the present. Return us, that we may do good works, for we have short days. This duty, I point this because the Sufi, the connection to the moral and mystical orientation in Ghazali's work, which applies, is well taken. I think I could have pointed more strongly to some definite mystical aspects of the work. And then also, Ajay is talking actually about an ascent from the heavens, and he says that the change of state is actually really from the higher levels down, because through viewing through viewing the low from the high, since the highest, though it has a lower, it has no higher.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you how you fit these passages into your talk.
There's much more mystical content in the Mashiach. So, for instance, Davidson, in his analysis of the Mashiach in terms of its philosophical content, says that it's an ostensibly Sufi work. So what I'm trying to engage in this in particular is to show that, yes, there is philosophical content, but let's look around that philosophical content and we'll find it's contextualized in a sort of Sufi mystical vision, not in a purely philosophical vision. So there are many passages that are much more clearly mystical than these. What I'm trying to show is that the philosophy itself is not the ultimate end of this text. In fact, the philosophical content does not exclude the mystical content. So it's certainly not an ostensibly mystical work. It is, in my reading, a purely mystical work that is interested in philosophy, interested in incorporating philosophy into the work. So there are many passages that highlight this sort of mystical vision of the text. That's a good one. I'm also fond of a discussion that's related to that, where he discusses how some people might be confused when we say that the manifestation of light is with everything. And in fact, Ibn Taymiyyah will critique Razi's repetition of al-Ghazali's discussion in the Mishkat on this basis and say that this is pantheism, essentially. And al-Ghazali is very careful in his presentation. He says, well, consider it like this, that the light and the hand and the shadow. When the hand moves, the shadow moves with it. But we can't say that they're together simultaneously. Clearly, the hand is prior. The hand has to move for the shadow to move. And he says, in this way, God's manifestation of being is prior to all other things. But his manifestation of being includes all other beings. He doesn't say this from eternity. But he says it includes all other beings. So here we can see that he's saying God's manifestation of being is an inherent relationship with other things. And that's not only our end, the highest ascent, but it's also our beginning. We emanate from him. And so really, the highest understanding, you're exactly right. And so when it gets to the end of the book, what they should do is turn over the hierarchy of lights and see that really all things come from God, and all things are going back to God. But to make his argument, he starts off with this world and goes to the higher world. But the mystical understanding is absolutely that this is a return to our source, the one who originates all being, the ultimate light. Sure.
Is there anything in what you've said about Ghazali today that is incompatible with orthodoxy? I mean, I'm sure that people like Ibn Taymiyyah would say yes.
Well, that's really interesting because Ibn Taymiyyah's critique, he seems to be critiquing, he doesn't name his source, but he writes a very polemic interpretation of the light verse himself, where he is speaking to an unnamed opponent, but it sounds a lot like he's talking about Razi, and Razi repeats al-Ghazali's interpretation of the light verse at length. He adds, for instance, 13 arguments to the 7 imperfections of the eye. And so he seems to be speaking to al-Razi. But one of the things that's really interesting, the difference between Razi and Ghazali is that Ghazali takes the literal meaning of the text. He says, God is the light of the heavens and the earth. We have to take this literally. God is light, and what we understand to be light is a metaphor for that light. And Razi doesn't do that. He goes the opposite way. He argues, no, we have to understand this metaphorically. And this seems to be what upsets Ibn Taymiyyah. So he's arguing against Razi, who's following Ghazali, but he wouldn't necessarily argue that al-Ghazali, although of course, he critiques the orthodoxy of al-Ghazali. I don't think that there's anything in this that contradicts al-Ghazali's conception of orthodoxy. Now, Frank has seriously questioned whether that conception is in fact an Ash'ari conception of orthodoxy. And I think that his criticism is interesting, but I think Delisle's critique of Frank is particularly difficult to overcome and maintain Frank's position. I think his work's valuable, but Delisle's criticism is fairly decisive for me. One of the things that he argues there is that Frank's expertise in early Ash'ari thought obscured for him the fact that Ghazali maintains the same basic Ash'ari program, which is that he's preserving the authority of reason against the Batiniya. He's arguing the Imam is not the authority, but rather reason has a role in determining what the text says. But at the same time, he's arguing against the philosophers that reason can override the meaning of Scripture or traditional understandings of God. And this is essentially the early Ash'ari program, only there it was arguing against the Hanbalites that, in fact, yes, reason has a role in theology, but against the Mu'tazilites that, in fact, that role should be limited. So we see that al-Ghazali is, in fact, maintaining that Ash'ari program. Now, certainly he incorporates elements of philosophy into that program that would strain Ibn Taymiyyah's patience. In fact, did strain his patience. But I don't read those as unorthodox. And I don't even necessarily read them as clashing with his, say, alleged Ash'arism.
I was fascinated by the presentation by a lot of things. I was particularly fascinated, one of the things was that was speaking about the Quran in the language of the Act of Intellect. And I haven't come across that any other place. Have you?
Well, that was really the one that floored me. I was like, wow. Some of these other passages are not as conclusive to me. It could be, again, I was saying we're trying to identify philosophical content and then look at it and see what is he doing with it. And that one was, to me, the one that was most obvious. He's using this language of moving from potentiality to actuality. He's using the exact same metaphor of Ibn Sina and al-Farabi. He knows that they use this language. He knows that they use that metaphor. So it's the example that's most compelling to me, and it's amazing to see it. I haven't seen it anywhere else, except he also repeats it in his work. If this is his authentic work, the Ma'arij, he repeats it there. But of course, his literature is an ocean, so I can't say that it's not anywhere else. It certainly could be. But it is really fascinating, and I can't even necessarily get my mind around all the implications of that. It does seem to me, as I'm arguing here, that he's saying revelation is above the conjunction with the intellect. One of the really interesting things in the Ma'arij is that he seems there to be arguing that there's sort of this conjunction that we have with the active, this obscure, I apologize, the conjunction that the average person has with the active intellect that transforms our knowledge to potential, that the prophet has not with the active intellect, but with a higher intellect. In fact, I think he's identifying this with the Amr Lahi, the command of God, and there's this ambiguous language in the Mishkah about the one who's obeyed, who's the one who turns the spheres. A lot of people who are debating about the philosophical content are obsessed with that passage and what is its significance. Does it suggest that God acts through intermediate causes? This is Frank's concern. And it's really interesting to compare these two in light of that passage where he seems to be placing the Quran as the active intellect. And so he might be, and what's interesting to me about that is that's a place where the Quran could be activating the average person's intellect, or it could just be activating the prophet's intellect. And then, through him, it activates everyone else's. And it seems like in the Ma'arij, he argues this because he says at one point that the law is the intellect from without, like the active intellect. But the intellect is the law, the divine law, he's saying here, from within. So this is, I would love to compare that passage and this one more closely. I just haven't had a chance yet. Other questions?
Oh.
You go ahead.
No, you go.
No. if I understand what you said this afternoon, al-Ghazali can get where he ends up without philosophy.
He does, and so.
And so if that's the case, if he can get where he wants to go without the use of philosophy, why bother?
Right. I think that's part of the temptation of, this is every time he is critique, this is ultimately his vanity, because he could. He incorporates philosophy and everything else because he's capable of it. He's that kind of intellect that can make these sort of allusions and parallels, which is another reason why it's surprising he doesn't include some others, because he seems to include as often as he can any allusion that he can. But he does make, in several places, he makes an argument that philosophy is not for everyone. You shouldn't engage in it. Just like some of these higher disclosures of mysticism, they're not for everyone. Only those who are capable of receiving it. In fact, he makes this argument at the beginning of Mishkat. The person he's writing to, he says, you're one who's capable of receiving this, but these are not secrets to be disclosed to everyone. So he's not saying that philosophy is for everyone, and maybe that this particular person he knows has that inclination, and so he's incorporating it. But again, what's really interesting, if we compare that to the other work that is more philosophical, but also more Asherite, oddly, we can see that he sort of tones down the philosophy in this work, if in fact they're both authentic. So he doesn't seem to think that the philosophy is necessary, but he doesn't seem to think that it's detrimental. And I think that again goes back to the constraint that we see him exercising and the tahafut, where he says philosophy is useful up to this point, beyond that, it's not. And the point that he designates only has 3 points above it, so most of philosophy actually embraces this. And he's just suspicious of metaphysics. But at the same time, he doesn't consider it in his al-Jam al-Awam or An Ilm al-Kalam, the warning of the masses from the sciences of theology. He does a similar thing where he's essentially arguing you don't need theology or philosophy. The best thing to guarantee certainty, as in the biography we see, is a certain Sufi experience. But you don't have, they're not rejected. They're just not necessarily useful. Other questions? Did you have something, Tim?
Oh, no.
I have 5 million things.
Or comments.
This is amazing.
Comments or
Well, I think my first, what I'm sort of ruminating over, I'm very excited about the fact that you found a Hebrew translation.
That was too.
Because that's, wow. But what's really great about it, and I keep noticing the metaphors, the notion of God as light and being, and these are things that run through Jewish philosophy from Maimonides and before that. Jewish thought and mysticism, but the same notion of the face, that everything becomes the face of God, and none of that is incompatible in the slightest. And I'll be interested to see, as you continue working on that, what you find in this translation. If you find that they treat them as, even the story of Abraham as sort of the slow discovery. Oh, the star. Okay, no. Okay, the moon. Oh, this. Oh, no. That's not incompatible. I mean, there would be Agadah, which would say that's not incompatible. That could be something that one of the rabbis came up with. So it'll be interesting to see how they treat this. If they sort of say, this is useful for us, and it's somebody else's thing, or this is our thing, and it'll just be interesting.
There's in fact a work, Toledot Ha'adam, or Yashar, or something, Yashar, that incorporates the story of Abraham's encounter with a series of bodies. One of the things I've been trying to track down is if that occurs elsewhere in rabbinic literature previous to this work, because this is a late work. It occurs in, it's written in medieval Spain.
Okay.
So it's entirely possible that this is it entered the tradition from the Muslims, not.
Then that makes sense. I mean,
I haven't been able to eliminate other rabbinic work. I haven't found a rabbinic work that's older than the book of Yashar that contains it. That doesn't mean it's not out there. But if there is not, then in fact, this is an example of a Quranic text coming into rabbinic tradition.
Well, and this is what's so fascinating is when I think about the Zohar and the similarities, just in sensibility also, and I don't know Arabic and there's no way I could ever, but it makes me wonder even more if that's one of the sort of routes of transmission. If they ended up, the Zohar tradition ended up being really sort of a spin on these texts that were being translated out of Arabic coming into, more so than I would have thought about. I mean, that's pretty exciting, you know, because the metaphors
I
are so
operate
similar.
kind of on the hunch that there's a good deal more influence there than is generally acknowledged, but I do think there is scholarship that looks at that, particularly the Brothers of Purity, and stuff are sometimes attributed as having a significant influence on the development of this tradition, particularly in Spain. So I would love to explore that at greater length at some point in my life.
Well, on the whole, all the parallels between these mystical works and the notion of spiritual senses and all the things that sort of end up in Christian, you know, philosophy of religion, and then even go on into further things like Kant. I mean, there's a sort of a straight line of these hierarchies.
This sort of goes back to what Professor Schwartz was saying. What's really interesting about, I find this program to be really at home with al-Ghazali's thought in general, because, for instance, we see in the Deliverance from Error, his biography, he argues against the Batiniya. He says, all of your arguments for the infallible Imam are correct. It's just the Imam is Muhammad, right? So we see, him saying, we see him doing this regularly, where he says, your arguments are correct, and then this is great polemic strategy, you know, it's part of the polemicist. He says, all the philosophers are right about their arguments about the faculties of the soul, that's all correct. But what it's referring to is not the Act of Intellect, it's the Quran. You know, so we see him making these moves, and some of it is just sort of sleight of hand, and he knows that it's not going to carry water. But other aspects of it, I think, disclose like his genuine belief that many of these understandings can be reconciled, and we see that drive, that passion, and throughout his career to reconcile theology, law, mysticism, and philosophy.
Right. Scott, this was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.